Hi, everybody. I'm just going to give everyone a couple minutes to join us, and then we will get started. Good morning. Good afternoon for our East Coasters. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Sonya Passi. I am the founder and CEO of Freefrom. I have been doing domestic violence work since I was 16 years old. I started at 16 hosting domestic violence awareness weeks at my high school. I myself am a queer survivor of intimate partner violence. I'm just so excited to present for you today and introduce my co-presenter, Amy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amy Durrence, and I'm the Director of Systems Change Initiatives with Freefrom. I started doing advocacy on behalf of survivors as a law student attorney in the domestic violence clinic at Georgetown Law School. I'm so thrilled to be a part of the Freefrom team and to be here this morning presenting in front of you all. So thanks so much for joining us, and looking forward to sharing what we've got for you.
So we're going to be recording today so that others can watch it after the webinar is over. And we're also going to be trying to make this as interactive as possible. It is almost the end of October. We're all zoomed out. We don't just want to talk at you for an hour. So for most of our conversations today, we'll use the chat function. But if you want to share something that you don't feel comfortable sharing publicly, please feel free to share it in the Q&A. And we are going to leave time at the end for questions from you, and we'll use the Q&A function at that point. I'm going to answer really quickly. Priya had a question. We will send out the recording straight after the webinar, and we'll include the PowerPoint slides as well. So before we get started, I want to take a minute and acknowledge that we are in a time of great uncertainty. It feels like we have been in a time of great uncertainty for a long time now. But we are weeks, days away from a very fraught election, and we have no way of knowing how it's going to go. We are about to have a Supreme Court that is stacked against reproductive justice and healthcare and other basic human rights that survivors need and deserve. And we're all, it feels like, just moving through the chaos. And so if you would like to, I would love to invite you to just take a deep breath in and a long exhale out. And for the next hour, to just allow yourself to worry less about what is, and give yourself the space to think about what could be, and give ourselves that moment in all of the mess that we are currently in. Okay. Let me start by laying the framework of what we're talking about. 1 in 4 women, 1 in 2 trans folks in the US will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. And we know that the #1 obstacle to survivors' safety is financial insecurity. And this is for 2 reasons. The first is it is incredibly expensive to experience intimate partner violence. The CDC estimates that intimate partner violence will cost a female survivor an average of $104,000. It's a staggering amount of money. And then on top of that, 99% of survivors experience economic abuse as part of the violence. And that can look like anything from not having access to your own bank accounts, not having access to your own cash, working but having to turn over your paycheck, not being allowed to work, having debt in your name that you don't know about. And so survivors are so often in a position where they are trying to get to safety, whatever that looks like for them, but they have 6 figures in costs associated with the harm, no job, no cash, sometimes a damaged credit score, and no fallback system. And so as we're thinking about how we address intimate partner violence in this country, we have to be considering what the financial reality of this problem looks like. Freefrom did a report back in August where we surveyed 1,300 survivors. And this slide really outlines very, very clearly just how expensive it is to experience intimate partner violence. Survivors have an average of $1,300 stolen from them by their harm doer each month. On top of that, harm doers incur an average of $16,000 in coerced and fraudulent debt in a survivor's name. Survivors lose out on 23 grand in income every year, and then almost $18,000 of property damage on top of that. And so this again is making the case for how we and our federal government really have to approach this as a financial issue. In that same report, we asked survivors how much money they need to get safe. And survivors on average said they need about $730, which in the grand scheme of the costs associated with us as a society solving this problem is nothing. And I really want you to keep that $730 in mind whenever you're talking to legislators about how expensive solving this problem is, because $730 is not a lot of money. It's not a daily number, it's how much survivors believe in this moment it would take for them to get to a place of safety. And in that same survey that we asked survivors about their financial position, we learned that survivors on average have less than $250 in savings and are 4 times more likely to have experienced material hardship in the past year compared to the average American adult. And so again, we start to see that the data all suggests that survivors are struggling economically, are more disadvantaged than the average American, and that intimate partner violence is a structural economic issue. It has economic causes and it has economic consequences. And when we are creating laws and we're creating systems and structures to support survivors, we have to be thinking about the economics of it. Intimate partner violence is a systemic economic issue that requires full societal accountability, starting with our federal government. And so over the next couple of slides, we're going to talk about what the federal government can do. And we as a team have outlined 4 actions. So action 1, address economic abuse in the Violence Against Women Act. If you're not familiar with the Violence Against Women Act, it is sort of the landmark federal piece of legislation that addresses domestic violence. Action 2, protect survivors when they bank. Action 3, provide effective relief for coerced and fraudulent debt. And action 4, create paid and protected leave for survivors. This is by no means an exhaustive list. As we go through the slides, we're gonna, as we talk through each action, ask you for your feedback. What ideas is it bringing up for you? Have you had experiences that relate to these actions? And then at the end, during our Q&A, we would love to hear from you what other ideas you have. What are actions 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 that we can be thinking about, that we can collectively be talking about in our communities and our conversations? Okay, action 1, addressing economic abuse in the Violence Against Women Act. So as I mentioned, it's this landmark piece of legislation. It is really the legislation through which most of the funding for domestic violence and addressing domestic violence comes. But, you know, as I mentioned earlier, 99% of survivors experience economic abuse, which means that economic abuse is as much a part of intimate partner violence as is physical abuse, as is psychological abuse. And yet, the Violence Against Women Act does not include economic abuse in its definition of intimate partner violence, and it doesn't address it. It doesn't have solutions and funding specifically for it in the same way that it does for restraining orders and shelters and other responses that we have to intimate partner violence. One of the things that we have all, confronted this year is violence perpetrated by law enforcement. And that's particularly important in the context of intimate partner violence, because 85% of funding from the Violence Against Women Act is dedicated to law enforcement. But we know from the National Domestic Violence Hotline that 80% of survivors are afraid to call the police. And so what happens if we redistribute that and really focus on solutions and ideas that survivors are wanting to access and do feel comfortable accessing and do feel adequately respond to their needs? We also have to talk about how under-resourced our movement is, even with the Violence Against Women Act, even with individual donors. Our organizations, our movement as a whole is under-resourced. People working in this movement are so often themselves survivors, but they are not making a living wage. And so we are all, as a movement, experiencing the scarcity and the financial insecurity that we're trying to solve for. And what role does VAWA have to play there? And as I said, the funding in VAWA focuses on, court responses, law enforcement responses, shelters, access to public assistance, restraining orders. These are all often life-saving measures, but they are crisis responses. And can we expand the continuum of support for survivors to start to think about what does long-term safety look like, and how do we ensure that survivors have the financial security to get to a place of long-term safety? 64% of survivors identify unrestricted cash as their top need. But this type of support for survivors, flexible funding, isn't supported by VAWA. Isn't funded by VAWA. Okay, that's the problem. I'm going to now turn it over to all of you. What is that bringing up for you? Are there other ways that you think VAWA isn't responding to survivors' needs? And as an alternate question, if this one feels like you've got more responses for it, how does the restricted nature of VAWA funding impede your work? And feel free to share any ideas that you have in the chat, and we can all take a look. I can't tell if people are typing or it's not bringing up anything for anyone, but I'll give it a couple more seconds. Still reeling from $730. VAWA should expand housing protections for survivors and funding for housing needs, 100%. If VAWA created protections for coerced debt, then the survivors I work with would be much more able to move forward. Thank you, Teal. Hi, Teal. The housing title, while offering strong protections to survivors accessing living in covered properties, only covers those properties and assistance. Thank you, Krista. Hi, Krista. I feel restraining orders actually disclose more information by law enforcement to the abuser. Thank you, Maria. Shelters are underfunded, and while a lot of our resources go to managing systems, while a lot of our resources go to managing systems and courts, which are funded. VAWA requires survivors to share their perpetrators' information. Most survivors are afraid to share. If survivors don't cooperate, they won't get the assistance they need. VAWA and VOCA don't fund prevention. Prevention is huge. Thank you all. These are all very, very important points. I'm going to hand it over to Amy.
Yeah, thanks everyone so much for sharing. So now let's dive into our solution. So we are calling on the next president and Congress to acknowledge and address economic abuse in VAWA by first expanding its definition of intimate partner violence to explicitly include economic abuse. You know, we cannot solve a problem that we don't properly define. And as Sonya mentioned, economic abuse is a reality for 99% of survivors. So we've got to acknowledge and address that reality in our laws. We're also calling for a divestment from police response and a reinvestment in programs and initiatives that prioritize financial security for survivors. So first, that looks like requiring that every VAWA grant have sufficient funding to ensure that service providers are paid a living wage. So if we're going to prioritize financial security for survivors, we've got to start by supporting service providers. As Sonya mentioned, a large number of service providers are survivors themselves. So we've got to make sure that we're supporting folks working in the movement. We're also calling for, as Sonya mentioned, funding specifically to support economic security programs for survivors. So that looks like programs that create jobs for survivors, like Annie Cannon's, that teaches survivors of trafficking how to code and then helps them find high-paying jobs in tech. It look like programs that provide credit or debt relief, or programs like the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence's training, Don't Knock the Hustle, which supports survivors in finding non-traditional ways to build income through things like street vending and other types of entrepreneurship. As Sonya mentioned, we're also calling for some funding for direct unrestricted cash assistance for survivors. So Sonya mentioned that 64% of survivors identified this kind of unrestricted cash as a top need. That was as part of our report that Sonya mentioned that we put out earlier this year. So we know that survivors want it. We know that survivors need it. We also know that it's cost effective. Remember that $730 number that Sonya mentioned earlier. So we've got to trust survivors. Survivors know best how to spend their money. Survivors know best how to stay safe. We've got to trust survivors and provide them with this direct cash assistance that they need. So we need some funding for that under VAWA. And then finally, we're calling for the removal of tort restrictions on legal assistance for victim grants. So essentially, there are restrictions in place right now for funding that prevents attorneys from helping survivors sue their harm doers and other in civil court to try to recoup some of their costs of the harm that they've experienced. Pro bono attorneys receiving funds through VAWA aren't allowed to represent survivors in those kinds of cases. So we need to remove those restrictions so we can open up another pathway for survivors to start recouping some of their costs and building that financial security that they need to stay safe.
I wanted to add something here because I think it does have a place in VAWA, and it answers a couple of the points that folks made in the chat about survivors having to cooperate with law enforcement, requiring a police report, and having to do both of those things to get so many basic services. One of the things that we've worked on this year is partnering with the Movement for Black Lives and SE Justice Group and the Civil Rights Court to make sure that the BREATHE Act, which is this incredibly important piece of legislation that's being promoted to support safety for Black lives, thinks about the needs of survivors. And one of the things that we're calling for in there is that survivors should not need to either cooperate with law enforcement or get a police report to get basic safety services. And yes, that's what we mean by unrestricted cash. Here's the cash, spend it how you need. I don't need receipts. You don't need to tell me how you spent it. Okay, action 2, protect survivors when they bank. So the US is a little bit behind the curve here, and a number of countries have been doing this work for some years now, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. And the basic problem is that survivors don't have a safe way to save money. Only 21% of survivors report having access to a safe and protected bank account. And as we talked about earlier, harm doers on average steal about $1,300 from survivors each month and restrict their use of an additional $1,100. And so survivors don't have safe access to their banks. That can be either because of the economic abuse and bank monitoring being part of that economic abuse, Or it can be because the abuse has been so financially devastating that they cannot make monthly minimums and other things that they need to avoid bank fees. And so essentially they can't afford to have a bank account. And that problem is then compounded by the fact that banks aren't thinking about this problem. They're not thinking about survivors, and they're not thinking about survivors as being their customers. We always think about intimate partner violence as happening over there as opposed to in our own communities and our own networks. And so bank staff are not trained to prevent, detect, or respond to economic abuse. We talked to a survivor who went with her harm doer to the bank to open an account because her mother wanted to be able to give her money for some medical procedures. And they went into the bank, and her harm doer said to the bank teller, "We're opening this account, and under no circumstances, we're opening this account, it's so that my mother-in-law can give my wife money. Under no circumstances is my wife can my wife have access to this account?" And so, what's happening in that moment is financial abuse. This bank teller had no training, did not know how to spot it, didn't know what to do in the moment. And so the account was opened in the husband's name only, and this survivor never got access to that money from her mother. Even once survivors leave harmful situations, harm doers are using banks to locate survivors and continue to track them. And we've heard awful, awful stories of survivors getting to a place of safety, moving to another state even, and then a letter is sent to their harm doer with their new address on it from their bank. And then survivors who leave have difficulty opening new bank accounts because very often they're leaving without the documents that they need, very often because those documents are kept by their harm doer. And so we're really kind of thinking about how do we make it possible for a survivor to save safely, understanding that bank accounts allow you to not only be keeping cash in a sock drawer. And we estimate that there are approximately 28.4 million survivors in the US who are banked and underserved because the economic abuse interferes with their ability to have sole and protected access to their bank accounts. Okay, now we're going to move to a poll question. And the question is this: have you ever faced challenges as a survivor with your own bank accounts, or worked with a survivor who has struggled to keep their bank accounts safe? It's totally anonymous, so you don't have to worry that we're tracking you, but would love to hear from you. Oh, I think we're getting the results. I don't see the results. Does anyone else see it? Oh yeah, there we go. Wow. 80% of folks said yes, 20% said no. That's a staggering number. Thank you all for sharing. For the 36 people who said yes, if you want to work with us on this, we'd love to work with you. For the 20% who said no, if you want to learn more about this, we'd love to talk to you about it. And we, well, no, I'll let Amy talk solutions with you.
It's really fun to be able to be the one that gets to talk about our proposed solutions. I will say that much. So we are calling on the next president and Congress to protect survivors while they bank through the passage of the Survivor Safety Banking Act. So we've modeled the Survivor Safety Banking Act after a piece of federal legislation that's known as the Senior Safe Act. And that essentially protects elder bank customers from experiencing elder financial exploitation while they bank. So our Survivor Safety Banking Act would require that financial institutions train management and staff in how to prevent, detect, and respond to economic abuse. So things like what Sonya mentioned, incidences of coerced or fraudulent debts, or harm doers taking out debts in survivors' names, harm doers monitoring or depleting survivors' bank accounts, those types of things. Or in the situation where the survivor actually went in to the bank location with the harm doer, and the harm doer said, under no circumstances should my wife have access to this account. If that individual, if that bank staff person had been trained, then perhaps that situation would have gone differently. The Act is also going to require that financial institutions report suspected cases of economic abuse to appropriate authorities. And just to be very clear here, this is intended to collect data that we really need about what economic abuse looks like, how it's happening in banks, so that we can really take that information and even create more programs and responses to help support survivors. So that reporting requirement is really all about us learning more about what's really going on with economic abuse, and specifically economic abuse at banks. It will also require financial institutions to designate internal teams to handle survivor accounts. So essentially what this means is that financial institutions would create an internal survivor group. So anytime a customer disclosed to a bank employee, I'm experiencing intimate partner violence, or I'm experiencing economic abuse, then that survivor's accounts and the interactions with that survivor from the financial institution would move into that internal designated group. And this would really be helpful for survivors, because this would mean that they wouldn't have to repeat their story, repeat their circumstances every time they called their bank to try to get help. It would also help because with the creation of this internal team, survivors would be receiving more consistent information. And all of this, of course, would lead to survivors receiving the help they need from their bank and receiving it faster. It would also, the Survivor Safety Banking Act would also require financial institutions to implement enhanced fraud protections on survivor accounts. So what that would look like would be things like working with a survivor to create specific flags based on their circumstances, so that banks would be able to flag suspicious activity more easily on their accounts. It would also look like financial institutions creating policies for how to ensure that survivors' contact information and addresses is kept confidential and secure. And it would also permit financial institutions to place temporary holds on transactions that they have a reasonable suspicion as a result of economic abuse. And of course, all of those things are going to be easier for the financial institution to accomplish when they have this designated internal team that handles survivors' accounts. And then finally, the Survivor Safety Banking Act would allow survivors to open accounts with ID and address alternatives. So as Sonya mentioned, oftentimes when a survivor leaves, they have to leave behind important documents, sometimes including their government-issued photo IDs. Oftentimes when folks are leaving, they don't necessarily have a permanent address that they're going to. So that makes opening those bank accounts really difficult. So with the Survivor Safety Banking Act, financial institutions would have to allow survivors to open those accounts with some alternatives. Banks would be able to then require that survivors come back and provide identification later on. But in order to help survivors open up those bank accounts when they leave, right when they leave, so they can start saving that money that they need to become financially secure so they can stay safe. And then finally, the Survivor Safety Banking Act would also include immunity from regulatory enforcement and private causes of actions for any of the activities that I just described, just so that banks are confident that they can do all the things we're asking them to do without worrying about getting sued or getting in trouble with regulators.
And, you know, we mentioned that this was modeled after the Senior Safe Act. The reason for that is banks now, virtually all banks, address elder abuse. And, you know, a lot of banks, including the big major ones like Wells Fargo and JP Morgan and Citibank, have designated teams like we're talking about here to address elder abuse. And their staff are trained in how to spot it and what to do when it occurs. And this really kind of happened. You know, banks were familiar with the problem, but they didn't know, as a very heavily regulated industry, what they could do to address it. And it was really the federal government taking initiative and putting in place this legislation that then signaled to banks that now was the time to do it. And it took a couple of years after that, but it really is sort of like something that is now addressed by banks. And for us, we see the same pathway for intimate partner violence.
Absolutely. And just to add a little bit onto that, Sonya, as part of that whole movement that Sonya just described with elder financial exploitation, combating that in the banks, part of what banks were required to do was report suspected elder abuse, elder financial exploitation when it happened. So all of a sudden, because of these requirements, we got a wealth of information about how elder customers at banks were experiencing financial exploitation. We saw a bigger, better landscape and more accurate picture of how often it was happening, how much it was costing folks. And that's really a piece of this Survivor Safety Banking Act that to me is really exciting, because once banks are trained to spot economic abuse and required to report it, then all of a sudden we're going to have so much more information about what this looks like, and we can be even more precise with developing and designing programs and responses to really help survivors and protect them from that kind of abuse at their banks and elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you. And before we move on, I wanted to share with you in the chat box our banking guidelines. So we put these together earlier this year. Really, Amy put these together earlier this year. And there are 11 guidelines that we have put together for banks in the US on what they can do to support customers experiencing intimate partner violence. And they are based on conversations with survivors here in the US, and also conversations with experts in other countries who have already been doing this work. And from that, we sort of selected items for the Survivor Safety Banking Act, things that we thought the federal government could actually weigh in on. But there's even more things that we think banks can do and take the initiative on themselves.
And I would love to talk to anyone about the banking guidelines. Just email me or call me, and I'd love to chat with you about them in more detail.
I think that the link might not be working for a few people. So we will resend it. We'll make sure it's working and we'll resend it. Thank you for letting us know. Okay, action 3, provide effective relief for coerced and fraudulent debt. So I feel like we talk about this a lot in the IPV movement, and I feel like people outside of the movement have absolutely no idea how anyone could be coerced into debt, and yet we know the realities of intimate partner violence much better. 52% of survivors experience coerced or fraudulent debt, averaging almost $16,000 a year, with 46% reporting credit damage as a result, and 14% reporting that they don't even know if there's credit damage because they haven't checked their credit score. And that in itself is a problem that needs to be addressed. It is further compounded by the fact that credit card companies, credit reporting agencies, and other creditors typically require a police report to prove fraud, creating an obstacle to relief for survivors. So as we talked about earlier, we already know that 80% of survivors are afraid to call the police. But we have also heard from a number of legal aid organizations and from a number of police departments that in cases of intimate partner violence, where there is coerced or fraudulent debt, they have a rule in their department that they do not provide a police report. And their reasoning is this is a civil matter, whatever that means. And the burden of proof is too high to prove that the survivor did not benefit from the debt that was taken out in their name. I'll give you an example of a client that we worked with. She came to us, at this point, she had been separated from her harm doer for 2 years, and debt collectors were starting to call her. And she very quickly learned that she had 7 credit cards in her name, with debt totaling $17,000 across those cards. The cards had never been paid off. She had never known that the cards existed because her harm doer was having the cards and the statements sent to his brother's house. And only now was she learning about it because debt collectors were calling. And together we called all of those credit card companies, and the debt wouldn't budge. And when the credit card companies were asking for a police report. We went to the police officer who had signed her restraining order. And that police officer said, yes, I signed the restraining order. Yes, I know. Yes, I believe that there was intimate partner violence in this case, but this part is none of my business and not something that I can weigh in on. So I can't sign a report like that for you to give to the creditors. Okay, poll question for you all. Nope, this is not a poll question. This is a chat box question. I would love to hear from folks. And the question is, oh, I'm sorry. Are there other challenges that you have witnessed or experienced in dealing with coerced fraudulent debt, either as a survivor yourself or working with survivors? I'm also realizing that for most of you, your questions are coming, or your answers are coming only to us as panelists. So I'm going to do a better job of reading them out loud before I comment on them. Krista, hi Krista, says this is an issue that we plan on prioritizing in California for legislative action and would love to work with you on solutions. We absolutely cannot wait, Krista. Rose is talking about the connection between credit and trying to find housing, and how difficult coerced and fraudulent debt makes that experience of looking for housing and finding that safety. Naomi shared many of our clients experience coerced debt specifically involving autos, including retail installment contracts, but also even abusers registering cars in their victims' names and accruing parking tickets and tolls. I've heard similarly, Naomi, about the parking tickets that survivors did not incur being a huge barrier to so many, so much progress in moving forward. Utilities, harm doers having utilities in the survivor's name, and of course you're not able to rent if you have an outstanding utilities bill. As a survivor, the calls from debt collectors can be angry and triggering. They can be very blameful and shameful. Thank you for sharing that, Patty. Someone is, thank you, Sarah, is sharing that right above the chat box where you type, there's a drop-down box, and you can change where it says send my message to panelists to pick all panelists and attendees, and then everyone will see what you're saying. Credit abuse by parents and family members, absolutely. There's a huge family component to this. And also, you know, we hear a lot of times where survivors are actually taking out credit cards in their children's names because that's the only thing that they know how to do, and then unknowingly or unintentionally perpetuating that financial harm. Yeah, make securing housing extremely difficult. Teal shared, we've seen so many issues when it comes to coerced debt, and also the emotional toll it takes on clients when they realize how little can be done to remove it. It feels overwhelming and demoralizing to so many survivors. Sarah shared, I heard of abusers falsely claiming that they paid rent, and then the survivor finding out that rent hasn't been paid for months. Oh my God. Sydney shared, harm doers abandoning properties and leases, leaving survivors responsible. Thank you all so much for sharing. I think we're seeing kind of the scope and scale and intricacies of this.
Yes, thank you all so much for sharing all of that experience. To really get into our solution, we are calling on the next president in Congress to amend the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and then a later amendment also known as the Fair and Accurate Credit Transaction Act. So these laws regulate credit reporting agencies to ensure that the information that they're gathering and distributing about consumers is fair and accurate. So basically that means that the purpose of these laws is to make sure that when you pull your credit report, all the information that you're seeing in your credit report is accurate and is not the result of some fraud or identity theft. However, these laws are currently only designed to prevent and respond to identity theft or fraud by strangers. And so in order to really provide effective relief to survivors for coerced and fraudulent debt, we have got to first expand the definition of identity theft within these laws to explicitly include intimate partner violence, domestic violence related coerced and fraudulent debt. Second, these laws do provide consumers who've experienced fraud or identity theft with some ways to deal with it. So for example, one of those ways is to block fraudulent activity from your credit report. However, as Sonya mentioned earlier, credit reporting agencies, credit card companies, and other creditors will routinely refuse to work with a consumer unless they have a police report that establishes fraud. And for all those reasons that Sonya mentioned, this is very problematic for survivors. Most survivors are afraid to call the police, and even when they do go to the police, a lot of police departments will refuse to complete a police report like that. And so we've got to remove the police report requirements to access that kind of relief under these laws, and instead amend the laws to expand the ways that survivors can prove that they've experienced coerced or fraudulent debt. So expand the ways that survivors can show the credit reporting agencies, credit card companies, and others, this was not me, this is coerced and fraudulent debt. One of those ways is through what we call qualified third-party certification, which is essentially a formal letter signed by someone like an attorney, an accountant, or a domestic violence counselor. We're also calling for all credit reporting agencies to be trained in economic abuse and have written protocols and procedures that they've got to adhere to when a consumer contacts them and says, I've been impacted by coerced or fraudulent debt. And then finally, we're calling for the creation of an economic abuse fraud alert. So this is mirrored after the active military duty fraud alert available for folks who are deployed as part of the military. And here's how it would work. A survivor who is concerned that a harm doer might attempt to take out a credit card in their name or otherwise try to get other credit in their name can would be able to call up a credit reporting agency and ask for an economic abuse fraud alert to be placed on their credit report. It would be free of charge. It would not require a police report. So once that fraud alert would be placed on a survivor's credit report for 7 years, anytime someone, for example, tried to take a credit card, apply for a credit card in that survivor's name, that credit card company would pull the survivor's credit report, see that economic abuse fraud alert, and they'd be required to contact the survivor with a safe phone number that the survivor provided when they asked for the economic abuse fraud alert. And so you can see how that would really protect survivors from a lot of coerced or fraudulent debt. If every time a harm doer tried to take out a credit card, the credit card company got on the phone with the survivor and said, is this really you? And the survivor says no. So with the creation of the economic abuse fraud alert would also call for a corresponding amendment you'll see here to what's called the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And so what the Equal Credit Opportunity Act does is it prevents lenders from discriminating against consumers based on things like race, gender, and marital status, religion, and other things. So we would want to expand that to explicitly prohibit lenders from discriminating against consumers based on their status as a survivor of economic abuse or intimate partner violence. And as Sonya mentioned before, this issue is so nuanced, and as all of you have shared, it shows up in many different ways and in many different places. What we have offered here as a solution is only a small part of what really needs to be done to really start responding to coerced and fraudulent debt and help survivors get relief. But this is a really great first step to start opening pathways for actual effective relief for survivors when they're experiencing that kind of coerced or fraudulent debt.
Thank you, Amy. Okay, action 4, create paid and protected leave for survivors. So we know that 60% of survivors lose their job as a result of the abuse, which means that as we talk about survivors' needs, we talk about the need for income to ensure financial security. We know that it's actually not just about survivors getting jobs, it's about survivors being able to keep those jobs. And part of what plays into survivors losing their jobs is the abuser, is the harm doer, is them potentially making trouble for the survivor at work. But a lot of times, and arguably most of the time, it's about the survivor getting fired or having to quit because the reality of their life is out of sync with the inflexibility of their job. We have worked with so many survivors who were employed, they had just become single parents, and every time daycare called and said, your kid has a runny nose, they had to go pick up the kid, and they got fired for doing that because they had done it 3 times in a month, but it was all they could do because they had to go pick up their kid. And so what that tells us is we really, really, really need to bring in employers as part of the solution here. Not to get too much into Amy's domain of solutions. I'm only the problem person. 77% of survivors report that the harm doer has interfered with their employment. And only 17 states require employers to give survivors leave to deal with the consequences of abuse. However, this leave is most typically accrued sick and vacation days. And of course, if you are having to take time off work to go and get a rape kit done, or go and deal with chronic pain that is a result of physical harm that you've experienced, or go to court, or look for a new apartment because you have to relocate, you are neither sick nor are you taking a vacation. And when we talked at the beginning of this webinar about framing and understanding intimate partner violence as a structural issue. If it is a structural issue, if it is a systemic issue, it means that we are all responsible for it. Our society has caused it, our society perpetuates it. And the cost and the repercussions of it should not fall solely on survivors. And we as a society really need to be absorbing that cost. And that means employers too. It means, our federal government doing what they can do. It means banks doing what they can do, credit card companies doing what they can do, and employers doing what they can do. And the last piece of information I'll share is no state requires employers to be trained in IPV. So, and I've seen this play out in my own communities. Something happens where, somebody's partner, somebody's harm doer sends an email to their boss and it's weird, and the boss just doesn't want to get involved, and they don't understand it, and they blame the survivor, and their response is to fire them, as opposed to getting the training to know what that looks like and to be more supportive to employees who are experiencing this problem.
And so, my turn, the solution person. We are calling on the next president and Congress to create paid and protected leaves for survivors at the federal level by expanding the Family Medical Leave Act. And so the Family Medical Leave Act currently provides workers with up to 12 work weeks of unpaid leave a year to either bond with a newborn child or a new addition to the family through foster care or adoption, and also to deal with a serious health condition either of the employees or of an employee's family member. It also provides 26 work weeks of unpaid leave for service members with serious injuries or illness. So we are calling on the federal government and the next president to expand the Family Medical Leave Act. First, to expand the eligible grounds for leave to explicitly include intimate partner violence, human trafficking, sexual assault, and stalking. So right now, technically, folks might be eligible for for leave under the Family Medical Leave Act if their experience of any of that has led to a serious health condition. But we want to expand those eligible grounds so anyone experiencing those things would be eligible for this leave. We'd also like to expand it to require that employers provide at least 10 days of paid and protected leave each year for employees to deal with the consequences of abuse. And these days would not deplete either accrued sick or vacation days. As Sonya mentioned, a lot of survivors can't afford to miss a day of paid work. And they especially can't afford to miss it if their job might not be waiting for them when they get back. So it is essential that this leave that is provided for survivors is both paid and protected. And again, that shouldn't deplete their accrued vacation or sick days. A survivor shouldn't be, worried about taking days off to go to court, because they've taken up all of their accrued sick days because they got the flu or something like that. As Sonya mentioned, survivors aren't sick, they're not on vacation. They need these days to deal with the consequences of abuse, and they need them to be paid, and they need them to be protected. And then, of course, also in addition, we would ask that the act prohibit discrimination and retaliation against employees based on their status as a survivor or their use of the leave. And essentially all that means is that an employer wouldn't be able to demote someone based on the fact that they took the leave, or based on the fact that they're a survivor, or otherwise discriminate or harass them based on their status as a survivor.
I only did it once. I thought I was going to do it every time, but I was still on mute and talking. As we all know, the federal government is not known for leading on innovation. And if we want them to understand survivors as needing paid and protected leave to deal with gender-based violence, we have to make that the norm. And so that is one of our projects here at Free From this year. First of all, at Free From, we offer 15 days paid leave to employees who experience intimate partner violence, actually any kind of gender-based violence, but also if an immediate family member does. But we are working with employers to do the same. And so Berkshire Bank, they have 1,500 employees, are partnering with us and offering 15 days paid and protected leave to all of their employees who may experience gender-based violence or have an immediate family member that might. And we are wanting to bring on more partners, big and small. We're working with foundations, we're working with other nonprofits, and we're also working with corporations to get to the point where a couple of years from now, when you think about leave, you think about vacation, you think about parental, you think about sick, and you think about gender-based violence leave. And so our final poll question for you today is simply to ask if you would be interested in working with Free From to encourage your employer to adopt a gender-based violence paid leave policy. And again, this is anonymous, but certainly we will reach out to you. Please reach out to us and we can find ways to work on this together. We have model language. We are supporting a number of folks right now and figuring out how to implement something like this. And at this point, really just want to understand if there's an appetite for it, if it's something that you think your employer should have. So would love to hear from you. Again, it's a simple yes, no, so.
Mm-hmm. And I hope that everyone who answers yes will reach out to me following this webinar. I would love to talk to you in more detail about it.
Awesome. That's awesome.
Okay, 34 people. I expect to hear from y'all after this webinar.
Okay, so at this point, before we do a quick close, let me check time. We have 7 minutes. We're actually doing well. First of all, on this slide is who to contact about any of these things. Contact Amy if you want to work with us on any of these measures, if you want to work with us on paid leave. If you want to partner on state level policy advocacy, our policy specialist, Sabrina Ham, is the best person to talk to. Though, again, if you reach out to Amy, we can make connections pretty quickly. And we also have a survivor wealth policy group that is survivors and advocates around the country that meet regularly to talk about kind of the things that we've been talking about on this webinar. What are new innovations that we can think of? How can we strategize around the best way to get this bill passed in our state? What have you done in your state? And it's a learning and collaborative group to do that. If you would like to join, we would love to have you. And Sabrina runs that group.
And is fabulous.
And is extremely fabulous. At this point, I would love to ask y'all, one, do you have any burning questions about what we've talked about? But two, do you have other ideas? Do you have other ideas for what we should be pushing the federal government to do and no idea is a stupid idea. At this point, we just want to get everything, you know, when we do exercises at Free From, we start by putting everything on paper and then deciding what we want to keep of that. So I would love to hear other priorities that you think policy advocates should have and legislators should have. Hi, Susan. Susan asked, do you have a lobbyist now in DC, and are you working on these initiatives now? So we are working on the Survivor Safe Banking Act right now. And we have interest from a number of legislators in our credit and coerced and fraudulent debt work. And so we're kind of drafting ideas for them now. We do not have a lobbyist. And I don't even know how we would find a lobbyist. I would love to talk to you about that, Susan. Another idea from Maria, financial assistance support for higher education and affordable housing. And Lorena seconded that, safe and affordable housing. I mean, we would love to talk to anyone who's got ideas for what we can push folks on housing, because absolutely that needs to be part of what our funding is going to and where the innovation is. Anything having to do with housing, it's the #1 need of survivors here. How can we create nationwide coordinated direct actions to say, these 4 reforms matter to my community, and make it an issue for the 2022 midterms? That is an excellent idea. Thank you so much for offering it. And we will figure out how to make it happen, because it feels like these feel like measures that we can get folks excited about and coordinated around, and really put pressure on Congress to move on. So thank you for that, Angelica. I am interested in being a lobbyist for you, said Zena. I am interested in that too, and we'd love to talk. Sydney shared, a part of the economic justice group that I have ran in the past was linking my group members with a bank rep, accountants, and other financial folks. Sydney, we'd love to talk to you about that, because we have an offering. We help survivors set up peer financial support groups, and it sounds like we'd have a lot to sync up on. Rose shared, would love to see some VAWA funds allocated to childcare as well, and support for any universal kindergarten measures. I love that idea. Thank you for it. Latasha shared, requiring prioritizing emergency transfers to the top of housing wait lists when survivors are in danger. That's extremely important. Thank you. Sarah shared, Minnesota Senator Tina Smith signed onto a letter urging the IRS to provide specific guidelines, support for IPV survivors who were unable to access their COVID economic impact payments due to abuse. Oh, great. We should look into that. We heard from a lot of people that we got cash grants to, that they hadn't been able to access their COVID economic impact payment, either because it was taken from them, or tax fraud, or they just couldn't access it. Do you see, Rachel shared, do you see greater appetite at the state level for paid leave rather than at the national level? It's a good question. I don't know if you have a better answer than me, Amy, but I don't know that we've.
Well, I think that it's our sort of approach and strategy isn't a federal only kind of strategy. We're actively looking for partnerships at the state level with state level advocates for pushing these initiatives forward at the state level. You know, I think our approach is kind of like, let's do both. If we can get something on the federal level, obviously that will create a floor. So everyone in the United States would have at least that, right? So of course it's going to be probably a little more difficult always to get something at the federal level for that reason. But we're just not limiting ourselves to that, to one approach, I guess I should say. Whereas, as Sonya mentioned, what we're really trying to do with paid and protected leave for survivors is to make it the norm. So the more we can talk about it, the more we can have these discussions, the more we can let folks know about this need, the better off we're going to be, whether or not we're actually successful at getting something passed at the federal level, I think is my response there. But I think that's a great question. And also, I'd love to talk about any of these issues with anyone offline after the webinar. I'm always ready to respond to an email and hop on a call. So
thank you all. I am sorry that I wasn't able to get through all of them, but we're figuring out how we can save them all so that we can follow up with you. And I just wanted to leave us with some closing thoughts. And I had 3 questions that I think about a lot, and would really invite you to as well. What if our movement was fully resourced? What could we achieve? And what if people working in the movement were paid a living wage by federal government grants to do this work that we're all doing on behalf of our country and our federal government that wants us to do this work? What if they actually paid us a living wage to do it? And what if our federal government stopped addressing intimate partner violence just as a short-term crisis and instead built the infrastructure to create a continuum of support for survivors? Thank you all so much. We hope that this is just the beginning of our conversations with you all. We will make sure to send out the slides, and we will send the recording. Please share it with whomever you would like to. And we look forward to keeping in touch and building on all of these ideas with you. Thank you.
thanks, everyone.
I don't know if we're still recording, but someone had the idea for us to do a monthly meeting to brainstorm, and I love that idea.
I love I love a brainstorm meeting.
Yeah, and we could do that not as a webinar, but as a call where everyone just gets to participate.
I have sticky notes right here ready to go.
Excellent.
And my blank wall back there is perfect.
Thank you all so much.